Okay, everyone, it is 2:15. I hope everyone had a good lunch and is ready to delve into the last few panels of this conference. Welcome to our panel entitled Toward a Standard for Fair AI-Driven Recruitment. So this panel is organized within the Horizon Europe Bias Project on mitigating diversity biases in AI systems in the labor market. So we will explore the role of standards in governing AI systems used in recruitment and employment. And as AI-driven hiring tools become more widespread, questions of fairness, transparency, accountability, and discrimination are becoming increasingly more important to address. And bringing together a team of interdisciplinary experts from academia, industry, and policy, this panel will examine how AI standards can move beyond technical benchmarks to embed normative protections while discussing the ambitions, limitation, and future directions of current standardization efforts. My name is Frida. I work as a research assistant at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. It's a mouthful. I did my master thesis in Science and Technology Studies in collaboration with the Bias Project, with the project leader, Roger Sora, as my supervisor. And I'm very lucky to be able to continue working on this project as a research assistant. Now, I want to introduce this beautiful bouquet of speakers that we have today. We have with us, first of all, Dr. Rania Wazir. She is a data scientist and mathematician with degrees from Stanford University and Brown University. She works extensively on trustworthy AI, natural language processing, and the detection and mitigation of bias and discrimination in AI systems, including projects examining algorithmic bias for the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Rania is a delegate to the CEN-CENELEC JTC 21 and ISO IEC JTC 1 Subcommittee 42, where she contributes to the development of international AI standards, including as editor of standards on transparency and on bias. We're very happy to have her on the panel to share her expertise in trustworthy AI and standardization. And then we have Adam Leon Smith. He is chair of the AIQI Consortium, a global initiative promoting the use of quality infrastructure for responsible AI. He's also deputy chair of the UK's National AI Standards Committee. He has led numerous AI standardization projects within ISO IEC JTC 1 Subcommittee 42 and JTC 21, and currently supports the European Commission in coordinating market surveillance authorities across the EU. And Adam brings his extensive expertise to this panel on how standards can support compliance, risk management, and trust in AI systems used in recruitment and employment contexts. And then we have Irene Camara. She works as associate professor at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology, and Society in the Netherlands, where she's also research coordinator. She is a member of the EU AI Board, the Dutch and Greek technical committees on privacy, cybersecurity, and AI, and recently joined JTC 21. Her work has received the Standards and Innovation Award by CEN-CENELEC, and her book Standardizing Data Protection, published by Oxford University Press, received the Best Book Award for 2025 to 2026 by the International Law and Technology Interest Groups of the American Society of International Law. And she's going to enlighten us today on the legal aspects of the standardization of AI. And last but not least, we have Eduard Foch Villaronga. He is Associate Professor and Director of Research at the E-Law Center for Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden University. And his research focuses on the legal and regulatory dimensions of AI and robotics, particularly in relation to governance, diversity, privacy, and inclusion. Eduard leads and contributes to several major European research projects on AI bias and discrimination, including the Bias Project. He's also active in international standardization through the Royal Netherlands Standardization Institute and ISO TC 299 Working Group 2. So his work on AI governance and diversity makes him a leading voice on the challenges and opportunities of standardizing AI systems used in recruitment and employment. Very happy to have you all here today. I was wondering, first of all, Eduard, maybe you can kick us off and explain to us how AI is being used in the labor market today.
Yeah, thank you for your kind introduction. So AI systems are currently increasingly deployed in the workplace to help HR professionals across different phases of the recruitment and selection. So in the first phase, AI tools may help create targeted job descriptions. Maybe in a second phase, they can be used to scan and process resumes, CVs, and motivation letters. Then recruiters may use AI during interviews, including the analysis of facial recognition systems, expressions, movement, and vocal patterns. And in a fourth phase, the use of AI systems may be focused on assessing like their skills, knowledge, and sometimes through gamified techniques. So taken together, these systems are reshaping how organizations identify, evaluate, and select candidates. And usually they are introduced in a way with a very nice promise of enhancing efficiency, flexibility, and objectivity. You know, they streamline hiring processes. Imagine like in an organization that they have like more than 1,000 applicants, for instance. And they allow also for continuous remote engagement with candidates, employees, accommodating interviews with different schedules or personal circumstances. And very much AI is presented in a way that can promote objectivity and also reduce human bias, fatigue, or inconsistency, particularly in tasks like candidate evaluation or policy application. Before going there,
if I can jump in, because we were talking about an example while we were preparing for the panel that's actually very relevant to the AI Act, which is upcoming, and very relevant to bias, but not actually in the way that you would normally think about it, which is discrimination and impact on fundamental rights. If there was a hypothetical social network where people could network professionally and make business contacts, and you could apply for jobs through that network, and let's say that network was prioritizing job applicants to show to the hiring manager, that would be a high-risk AI system under Annex 3 of the AI Act. And let's say that network was taking into account things other than your suitability for the job. Let's say whether you verified your profile, whether you are in fact a premium member, whether your level of engagement on that social media site was high. Taking into account those things is taking into account data that's not relevant to the intended purpose. And that is an example of it's a very interesting example because it isn't about discrimination, but it is a non-compliant AI system under legislation, which is coming into effect soon in this context.
Yeah, like, and many people, when then like in the bias project, like we actually like asked people whether they would identify certain social media platforms as related with or AI or so, like they would not identify that directly, no? And also people perceive these systems also differently, no? I think that you, Frida, like has been doing like a lot of wonderful research like on how people perceive that. Do you want to share a little bit like?
Yes, for my master thesis, I interviewed 13 graduate students currently applying for jobs. So mostly about like the digital job application process, and we talked a lot about AI and their thoughts and strategies in relation to AI in the application process. And first of all, a central finding in my thesis is that many job seekers feel that the recruitment process, it loses a certain degree of humanity, as they say, when AI is involved. And nearly all my participants expressed that being evaluated and assessed by a machine feels less fair and less reassuring than being evaluated by a human. And some of the reasons for that is that they worry that AI systems can't understand context or pick up on personality traits or tolerate small mistakes in the same way that a recruiter can. For example, some fear that a single wrong or misspelled word or maybe a missing keyword in their application could lead to rejection, even if they were an otherwise strong candidate. On the other hand, some of my informants had this idea that AI could be more consistent and impartial and objective than humans, because they acknowledge that humans are also inherently very biased. But despite this, they still trusted human judgment more, simply because it felt more reassuring and more fair to know that a human being was behind the decision. And a second key finding in my thesis is that job seekers, they're not passive in their approach to potentially being assessed by AI, but they actively develop strategies to adapt to these AI screening tools. And in a way, take advantage of the biases embedded in these systems. So some try to optimize their applications for machine readability and AI assessment by using specific keywords or writing styles. One of my informants described how they use generative AI to mirror the language used in the job description or advertisement, because they believe that an AI screening tool is going to pick up on that and rate them higher than other applicants. But because the technology is so black boxed, all these strategies are largely based on guesswork and imaginaries of how the technology works, rather than actual information on the criteria used in the assessment.
Yeah, so I think that this is really showing on how these systems are not experienced as neutral or as objective, no? And in fact, what we see is that AI-driven recruitment processes can reinforce existing vulnerabilities. Especially, you need to understand that some of these systems actually they are embedded in the workplace where there is power structures, there are information asymmetries, unequal decision-making power, and also economic dependence. No? So as a result, these systems can actually have the power to amplify and show even more the vulnerability of workers and job applicants. So some critical concerns have emerged, also in the literature, including cost barriers, privacy and data protection, the opacity of some of these AI systems, which make a little bit difficult for people to also understand what are the inner workings of these systems and how could they even challenge if they have had a negative impact. But perhaps one of the most pressing concerns is the bias and discrimination. These systems can reproduce long-standing diversity biases embedded in training, data, and institutional practices, leading to discriminatory outcomes and reinforcing existing forms of social marginalization. I think that is why these systems have become a prominent regulatory area of attention. The AI Act classifies these systems as high risk systems. But as we have shown in the Bias Project and other systems, not all of them, they are high-risk systems. It depends on what the technology does, but also the specific context and the purpose and how these systems are used in practice. And the AI Act, as you may know, introduced very specific obligations for some of these systems to make them more trustworthy, more aligned with fundamental rights. But the legislator cannot do everything. So the AI Act is part of the new, maybe old by now, legislative framework, in which then standards actually is going to play a role. And that is what we are going to discuss here. So Irene, could you explain us a little bit more what is a harmonized standard and what's the role in the AI Act?
Yes, of course. So if I would ask the room, how many of you know about standards? What would be, all right. And do you know about product safety standards or AI standards in specific? Yes? Okay, it's a very informed audience. But I think I should still make the introduction to explain a little bit how standards emerged in this digital rule book. So we started from the 80s, where standards exist more than 150 years, right? So it's not a new thing. But the relationship with European standards or international standards that are becoming European through a specific process with EU law started somewhere in the 80s. And this is where the European legislator at some point realized that indeed we cannot include all of the rules, all of the technical specificities of how a product can be designed to be safe and produced to be safe. We cannot have all these specific details in the law. So because the law would be very soon outdated and there could not be a consensus. So imagine it is difficult to reach a consensus in some standardization committees, let alone you would think legislators and of different member states of the European Union. So at some point it was decided that the very technical details of how a product can be designed, or a toy, for example, can be designed to be safe, those would be determined in technical standards. And essentially, technical standards are documents, so it's not some sort of technology. I talk to my students sometimes, they hear technical standards and they think, oh, it's some magic technology. No, it's just a document that includes different requirements, controls, or how we want to call them in different types of requirements. And it provides guidance, so it's a voluntary, at least in principle, a document that organizations can follow to get advice on how they can design their product to be safe. So this regulatory technique was quite popular in terms of product safety in the European Union, but that was all about it for, I think, around 20 years. At some point, the European Commission started being a lot of in favor of this legislative technique. So now, if we look at the European Digital Rulebook, we see that, I think, almost all of those laws, so this Cyber Resilience Act, the NIS2, Network Information Security Directive 2, the AI Act, of course, the GDPR in the beginning, but not in the final text, and so on and so forth. They do include references to standards. They're not all of the same type of references, but that's something that we can discuss perhaps later on. So what is happening essentially is that in the AI Act, and you will discuss a bit more in depth about this, the legislator says, well, we need AI systems, or we need cybersecurity products that are secure, that are robust, that are fair, etc., and so on and so forth. But how can a system be designed to be complying with these requirements? This is further explained in those technical standards. And specifically, those standards that are mandated by the legislator, so the European Commission says, well, I'm asking the European standards organizations, these are specifically CEN-CENELEC and ETSI, so not anyone can develop European standards. These three organizations, they're asked by the European Commission to develop a certain list of standards. The technical committees, and where my co-panelists here will explain a little bit more, then develop those standards. And later on, the European Commission, with the help of the AI office or with external consultants in other cases, assess whether those standards comply with the initial request. Did they actually do the job that they asked them to do? And if yes, then they're published in the official journal of the European Union. So that's a little bit the general process. So those standards that are then published in the Journal of the European Union do get what we call a presumption of conformity. And this is what really makes a difference between international standards and these European harmonized standards. Because once a provider will follow this specific standard, this harmonized standard, this provider, their system or their product is presumed to comply with a relevant legal requirement. So you can imagine that for a voluntary measure, so this is a really, really important regulatory benefit. And this is, I think that's my view, this is why there is so much attention also to the quality of the standards, what goes into the standard, and who develops these standards, who participates in the technical committees. So I give the floor to you for the specifics on the AI.
Yeah, if we could get up the website, that would be great. So first of all, can you imagine if when they passed GDPR, they said, everybody get together and agree what informed consent means, and then we'll implement the law? You would be waiting a long time, right? And that's why it is taking a long time to produce some of these standards. At the moment, we think there will be 16 standards responding to the AI Act. 3 of them are published, 5 of them are currently under public consultation, and 6 of them we're still arguing about the words before we send them out to public consultation. If we could just scroll down a bit, there's some caveats on the screen that say this is an unofficial source and subject to change, etc. This website is ai-act-standards.com, and you can see here a number of articles of the AI Act. Articles 9 to 15 are what we call essential requirements. They are, as Irene was saying, related to product safety. So this is very, very different to standards you might have seen before in, say, cybersecurity and things like that. Okay? These are not standards about the organization and what the organization must do. They are standards about the AI system and what the AI system itself must do. And this is a really important point that's very different to other regulations in technology. The risk management process does not involve having a spreadsheet and a list of risk mitigations. That may be part of it, but the mitigations have to be in the system. You can't have a process that a human is running to mitigate risks. You can't inject a human, you can't put a human in the loop in an AI system and change the risk profile from unacceptable to acceptable. These standards are addressing the system itself, with one exception, which is Article 17, which is the quality management system, which is a traditional, the organization shall do this type of standard. And it's all about how the organization manages compliance. To give you some quantitative examples here, Article 17 is 540 words long. And in the standard, we've turned that into 140 mandatory requirements. If you adhere to those 140 requirements, 35 countries, including thousands of experts from industry and civil society, and the European Commission have agreed that you will be in conformity. So that's a really powerful tool that is a lot cheaper than asking a very expensive lawyer what you should do, because you pay, well, actually we'll come to how much you pay a little bit when we talk about Malamud, but you can pay about 50 euros to get a copy of these documents. And one thing I'd add to Irene's description of the process is the process is not about producing a document. The process is about producing consensus between all the stakeholders involved. And that's what makes this process really, really powerful.
Could you enlighten us maybe, Adam, on your experience with AI and bias standardization?
That's actually how I ended up in this weird role. I was actually CTO of a startup, and we had some ML doing assignment of tasks to employees. And there was clearly some bias in there with regard to names from a certain part of the world. And being from a software testing background, I'm used to using standards for things. So I immediately went and looked for the standard, and I found no standard. And this isn't okay, there should be a standard. So I ended up joining the UK National Standards Body and volunteering to run the first ISO IEC project on bias, which was published, I think, in 2020 or 2021, which was a technical report. So just an informative summary of the topic of bias, which was really hard because that's an international arena. You've got Russia, China, the US, you've got people in the room who say things like data should not be changed, training data should not be altered for political purposes. And that's their genuine held view. So we came up with this informative report, and then we managed to convince national bodies to allow us to do a normative standard, which was published, I think, in 2022. But it is not reflective of European fundamental rights and values. It is a good baseline. It's what everyone could agree on, but there's more work that has to be done, which is why we have projects in Europe, which I think we'll come more to later.
And Rania, I believe you also have some experience with AI and bias.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, the project that Adam led was my hook into standardization as well. Funnily enough, I also ended up there because I was working on machine learning technology and wondering, how do you even know if this thing works? What are the best practices? And I didn't find a standard, so I decided to make one. And fast forward to CEN-CENELEC and the AI Act requirements, and there is a project ongoing for understanding how to manage, how to detect, and how to control bias in AI systems. And well, before I tell you a little bit about this project, I want to ask the room, when I say bias, what are you thinking? And if I can't collect all your answers right now, but basically 2 years, 3 years of your project were spent defining that one word. And so every time we have a project on bias or any kind of standards project, one of the most important things that we do is get all the people in the room to agree, what are we talking about? And I can tell you that's actually the hardest part. But when we're talking about things like bias, like fundamental rights, in my view, that's actually one of the most important conversations that can happen. You can't measure it, you can't mitigate it, you can't manage it if you're all talking about different things. So bringing these people together into one project and having them discuss with each other until consensus is reached, in my view, is one of the most valuable things that standardization does for us.
And did you get the consensus on that or not? Tell us.
Yes, we did. We got consensus on bias, although every single project that comes afterwards, we almost have to reopen the discussion on what is bias. Yeah.
Okay, so bringing us back to kind of the topic of this panel, which is the labor market. How would the labor market lens fit in with developing a standard on AI and bias?
So, I'll take that. Clearly, bias is one of the most problematic issues that are faced in the labor market, and we have to think all of these technologies that we're developing aren't developed in a vacuum. So, if there was already bias and discrimination in the analog world, when you create a system, the system is created by humans. The system is going to recreate, and AI scales things. It's going to scale whatever bias and discrimination you have. So when we're talking about bias in a standard and how to control it, how to manage it, it's very important to have people from the labor market participate in these conversations, because they bring in the perspective of how are you affected? Who is affected? Every context that you put in an AI system will have its own particularities. And in order to understand how to create a standard that will help you manage that, you need to understand how context plays into it. And a lot of bias projects actually have had the participation of ETUC, so the labor union, but it would definitely benefit from more participation from potential employees, people who would go through this process.
If I can just put it in the context of some of the standards we were talking about before, the risk management standard is, of course, the first place that you would start, where you would identify potential risks to fundamental rights, but also to health and safety. Bias is not always about people. It can be about inanimate objects. So in that risk process, you would be required to do some testing of the system to identify new risks. You would then also use the data standard. So if you look at the AI Act, there are requirements about data that are not explicitly about bias. So there are requirements that data is relevant, as I mentioned before, but also that it's representative and complete. And there is also a bias standard that we have that isn't just about the data, because bias is related to a number of topics in the AI Act, for example, accuracy. And that actually ties in with why we have so much difficulty defining bias, because bias is actually necessary for machine learning systems to function. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we talk in standards a lot, we use the phrase unwanted bias to talk about things that we don't want to see. And then we also have the quality management system standard, which it sets up the organization to make sure all these requirements are complied with throughout the life cycle.
And could you explain us a little bit then, like, what is the ambition that then the EU has with respect to bias? Because in a way, like it felt that it was a little bit across or horizontal, but then like you have like an AI specific standard. Like, could you explain us a little bit what's the interplay then, like, or what is the role then of this AI standalone standard that you guys worked on, and then also whether we will see bits and bytes in other of the standards also with that?
Part of the reason why bias was extracted and given its own standard is that, it requires a particular expertise that you're not going to find if you go into a project which is on risk management, or if you go into a project on data. So in the end, bias has to work together with the other standards, bringing in some of the concepts and some of the methods from risk management, bringing in some of the concepts from accuracy and robustness, bringing in some of the aspects from data and playing that back to those standards. And so bias has ended up being kind of this horizontal project that interacts with other standards, but it lives on its own because it required very technical expertise. We dive deep down into how are you actually going to measure this thing called bias, with specifying metrics and specifying how you look at the data, together with this very kind of fundamental rights approach. How do I take context? How do I take normative concepts and translate them into something technical?
Yeah, because I think that like this is a little bit like one of the challenges, no? That then in a way there is on the one side the need of establishing the metrics and being specific and objective, and then on the other side then there is these big concepts, no, like of fairness, and so do you think you, Adam, but also Irene, like that it may end up like then reducing it to like there's a lot of discussion on whether then we will end up like having enormous checklist of 140 requirements, or do you think that this is actually going to help then not only the system but actually then in the broader context where the AI system is going to be deployed?
Do I think having standards will help mitigate bias in reality, do you mean?
Like in a way like that sometimes like when then you are confronted like with dealing with the compliance on the one side and then being very technical on the other side, but then knowing that then when I think about the labor market, it's huge, you know, and then every sector is also very specific, and then depending on the phases that you are going to be using, some of these systems may also change dramatically. And thinking then like how this very technical standard that can improve the system can actually also at the same time help on the organization, knowing that you said that the standards like are very much more focused on the systems rather than on the organization themselves.
Yes, I think the adoption of the standards, I mean, Article 1 of the AI Act is about reducing risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights. So everything that helps its implementation should, in theory, help society. And absolutely, if you implement the standards, in most cases, you're going to end up with a much better outcome for both the system developers and society, for sure.
If I may add,
Oh.
maybe it's not the popular opinion with people that have to implement the standard, but 140 requirements, yes, go ahead. If this means that you get a green light, that you comply, that with the legal requirement, yes, you have to go through these 140 requirements and even more. Because, of course, you will get the standards. You will have a team to be able to comply with the standard. But this is not the end of the journey, as we all know, right? So it's also a matter of expectation. So you get the standards, you get some important guidance on what to do, because this indeed is really technical knowledge exists only with some few experts, and this consensus-making process is very important. So you do get the best practices, but that does not mean that the moment you get the standard, you have the golden solution, and then your system is ready to go to the markets, and there's no bias in the system anymore, obviously. So I think what could be helpful, perhaps, is to, and I wanted to ask you, if I may also ask questions, is there a plan to also have a technical report or some guidance, not at the level of European harmonized standard, but some guidance on how to implement or contextualize these specific standards in different contexts, like the labor market or this kind of algorithm?
So there's a couple of factors there. The first factor is we're all exhausted after 3 years of trying to get these standards done. So we're not thinking about new projects at the moment, but we will turn to that. And particularly, as you said there, for sector-specific needs, I can easily see us starting to develop technical reports and other standards, but I don't know whether it will be us, the Horizontal AI Standards Committee, or maybe the different sectoral committees, like I think you're on the Robotics Committee, will do that work. Yeah. That isn't clear yet. And it is also a function of expert participation. Consensus can't just happen with 3 people. And I'll be honest, there are no HR AI companies involved. They are generally in denial about being regulated at the moment, certainly not sending people to the standards committees to try and work out solutions. So I think once a lot of people that are in Annex 3 realise they're suddenly regulated in a product safety system, not the sort of regulation they're used to, they'll start to discover all this, and hopefully there'll be more work.
Yeah. Well, it could be that they're also not informed, right? So participation is important, of course. Or, trade union, as you mentioned, or labor unions can also be, so representatives that are not part of the Annex 3, and this is something that perhaps should change. But through their national committees, perhaps there's a way forward. But there's a lot to be done also at the national level for technical committees to gather the right experts and push them to represent the national standards body at the European committees. Yeah.
If I can add a point, I'm going to put my SME hat on for a second. I don't think we should be scared by the number of requirements as long as they are clear. So as a company, I much prefer to have a lot of requirements that are clear and give me proper guidance on what to do, than to have 1 or 2 high-level requirements that then I have to do all the legwork in order to interpret them. So I think some of these conversations where people start scaring you with the number of shell statements, that's what we call a requirement in standards talk, are misleading. And having a long standard which is clear and gives you proper guidance is much better in some situations than a short one with high-level stuff. Yeah.
If I can just build on that. So words that you will normally see in laws are red flags to us in standards. So we try not to write appropriate, relevant, consider, should, where technically feasible. And that's what we mean by clear requirements that are obvious how you implement. And that is what makes them cheap to implement and stops people having to go and think for hours about what appropriate might mean in the context of a particular sentence.
And you were saying at some point about consensus. Can you explain us a little bit more about this? Is it a consensus with the people that you had in the room, or were there active efforts to really involve many stakeholders? How did it work? Because one once you want to participate like on a committee and maybe people in the room or may want to participate or so, there's a lot of challenges that come with that, being part of it, probably like it's not your main work, then dealing with a lot of complexities there, and then the consensus sometimes it's from the people that there is in that room, no, like, and is that representative? I think that the European Union is very much willing, like, to put an emphasis on the representativeness of different stakeholders, and so how was your experience with that, and how diverse was that committee?
I think you can speak to how diverse JTC 21 is.
Yeah, so let's take those things separately, inclusivity and consensus process. So in terms of inclusivity, there's two answers. The NLF system is set up to fund consumer groups, trade unions, and representatives of small businesses to participate in standards. The AI committee in CEN-CENELEC is the biggest European standardization committee ever, and it is absolutely diverse, with people ranging from human rights lawyers through to big tech. However, and this ties in with consensus, consensus is the absence of sustained dissent. It's not unanimity, it's not voting. It is coming to a shared opinion. The way I like to think of it is, you know you've got consensus because when you leave the room, everyone is equally unhappy. Nobody's got what they wanted, but they can live with what we've all agreed to. Now, standards projects take 3 years. So if you think about it, people from particular interest groups have to sustain dissent for 3 years, when sometimes that's 8 hours a week of meetings. So although the process is very inclusive, many of the participants simply do not have the funding to sustain dissent for that long. Do you want to add to that?
I also want to add something, as you can imagine. So indeed, consensus is not unanimity, and it's a very hard process, but I'm also mindful of the trade-offs that people do to reach an agreement. Also, when there are deadlines from the Commission pushing or postponing the implementation of the AI Act or some requirements in order to have the standards published first. So in terms of pressure and this need to reach a consensus, some politics are taking place, and not with a negative sense of it, but there are some trade-offs that are happening there, and we should be mindful of those. That we're talking about human rights, of course, and we need to make sure that those are not sacrificed in the because of the pressure to finish and publish the standards. So that's one thing. And in terms of participation and representation, of course, there are these Annex 3 organizations that we say, the Consumer Association, that and 3 more, that get funding from the European Commission, but they don't have voting rights at the European level. So you need to be really committed to be following all of these meetings just to have your opinion heard without having the right to vote. But they do, of course, have representatives in national technical committees, and some of them, like ANEC, are doing excellent work into making sure that their viewpoints are transmitted to their national representatives, and then through that have their opinions passed through in comments or maybe vote in favor of their opinions. But I would say that, and I have argued about this in several fora and papers, that those organizations also need voting rights, so that they are equally heard when they are sitting around the table. And SMEs included, they are not in a favorable position in general, not in these committees. And the other thing I wanted to say is that the situation with JTC 21 is something new, and it's not common. When we're talking about technical committees, usually we have big tech or industry represented, and we also have some people that are really committed without funding, but they're trying to find funding, that participate on their own time or they really have to convince their manager to send them to these committees. So I think it's a positive step that we have this change, this increased interest in JTC 21. It does make our life a little bit more complicated, but at least we can be sure that the outcome will be of better quality than in other cases. And I think this didn't come on its own. I wanted to mention the Ombudsman case. It was, I think it was initiated somewhere in the fall. It's closed now, but it was also a positive step where the Ombudswoman actually asked the European Commission about issues of representation in JTC 21. Because, of course, it is privately organized, so the standards organizations are not public institutions, but the European Commission does have a very important role of oversight. So they do issue the standardization request. They ask the committees what kind of standards they want. They do participate as observers throughout the whole process. And in the end, they approve or not the standard to be published in the official journal. So this kind of oversight role got the attention of the Ombudswoman, and they asked how balanced and represented, among other things, the committee is. So the case is closed now because the Ombudswoman was satisfied with the response from the Commission. But I think it is a positive step into showing that we are aware that it is important to have representation for a better quality outcome.
Yeah, and that ties with the Malamud case,
yes,
no? Basically, it's all about, at the end of the day, of access to law, no? The Malamud case was a very recent case. There was a public interest organization that requested access to harmonized standards that were referenced in the EU legislation, and as we have seen, used to demonstrate legal compliance. And the European Commission at the beginning, they refused the access. Usually they use arguments that they were copyright, commercial interest, and so. But the case eventually arrived to the European Court of Justice, which ruled that there is an overriding public interest in accessing these standards when they effectively form part of the EU law. So now, just for you to know, following that judgment, individuals can request access to harmonized standards from the European Commission under EU access to document rules. And some standards are now also available through dedicated read-only access portals, such eNorm. But yeah, then that also raises a little bit of questions because sometimes these harmonized standards, they are also part of the international standards, which means that then the European citizens may have that right, but not then on the global side. But also that the technical reports that you were actually asking for, no, Irene, those are also not part of it, no? So there's still a little bit of limitations on that. I think that still it's finally something good, no? That we can actually, well, if you are telling me that those specifications will show me proof compliance, then they should be accessible. But yeah, you want to?
Yeah, this all started with a problem with some concrete floors in 2001 in Ireland. And, it's a very long history, but we finally got to standards that are harmonised, must be available free, which is, I think it's fantastic. It's very difficult for the standards organisations, though, because the standards organisations that publish standards for free, generally ones that charge people to come to the meetings. And that's a very different type of governance to national delegations. So there's a lot of trade-offs that the standardization system has to make to be able to get there. I think for now the courts have solved that by saying the EU has to pay ISO IEC licensing fees. I think that's the latest position.
Yeah. So there is also a pending case with ISO and IC, right? The General Court that followed the Malamud case, exactly because not all harmonized standards are developed homegrown standards, but they're ISO standards that are accepted as European standards. So ISO and IC said, okay, you want to have your part of EU law kind of approach, but we develop standards globally, not having in mind that they will be available for free in some certain region. So we will see how this will go, but indeed the case law is even earlier with James Elliott and even before that. So all scholars working with standards like public law, scholars working on standardization, we have been waiting for this moment of 2024 fall, I have to say, where the court would actually explicitly say, yes, part of EU law and this means X, Y, Z. So it was a great victory, I would say, for people that have been advocating for open unhindered access, because of course you can go to Delft and access a standard, but you have to travel from Groningen or from the other end of the country to go to somewhere to read a standard that is supposed to be part of EU law. So there were some solutions in place even before that, but now things need to be done differently, and this is a very positive step.
Yeah, I mean, you said something about what kind of stakeholder groups we should be listening to in order to shape these standards. But what can I do? What can we do to help shape these standards? What's the role that we can have? Adam, you have some insights on that?
Yeah, Rania, I'm going to go first.
Okay. Actually, the standardization process has many different ways for people to participate, starting with joining your national standards body and getting delegated to a project. But as we've already heard, that requires dedication and time that not everybody might have. So there are alternatives. Every standard has different milestones that it has to go through, and every standard has to go through a public inquiry phase. During public inquiry, the standard is open to be read by the public, and the public can make comments. This is something that very few people are actually aware of, so then there are very few public comments coming in. But during public inquiry phase, the standards are open and viewable to the public. This happens through every national standards body. Each one has its own way of doing this. But you can read the standard, you can submit your comments, and your comments are then taken through your national standards body and submitted to the commenting phase of the standard.
But you need to be part of the national standard body.
No, you don't.
Oh.
It's the commenting is open to the public.
Okay.
What happens though is if you want your comments to be defended in the project committee, you do need to have someone there who understands your arguments and is ready to present them and defend them. So it's not a perfect mechanism, but it is one way of getting your voice heard. An alternative, and this also some NGOs are finding this is getting together, maybe finding one who will participate in different projects and getting in their comments this way. And these are all processes that are developing. I think a lot of them are developing in JTC 21 because it has received so much interest. And I think one great thing would be if you guys brainstorm how else could you participate?
So just to add, right now there are two standards in this phase. The risk management standard for the AI Act, which is 18228, and the cybersecurity standard for the AI Act. And the week after next, we will launch a public inquiry for the logging standards for Article 12.
Yeah, and last thing, so some national committees, standards bodies, they do charge some fee if you want to participate, but not all of them. So you don't have to participate through the committee where you're, the national standards body where you're based. For example, so if Greece does not, Greece is a language barrier, but for example, in Luxembourg, I know that they have English-speaking work language committees. So perhaps you can join through another committee and see, and the meetings are online. So you can find ways to participate without having to pay a fee. Or in the Netherlands, there is a reduced fee for academia and NGOs, SMEs, etc. So that's also a way to look at it.
In the UK, it's completely free if you're in the UK.
In Austria too, by the way, if you were looking for a small country.
Okay, I think we're going to open it up to questions, comments from the audience. We have a question back there.
Hello, my name is Salome. I'm from Göttingen University. I have two questions, basically, like from GDPR perspective. In AI-driven requirement, where automated tools may screen, rank, or exclude candidates before any human review, how should we interpret Article 22 GDPR in practice? Well, when does human involvement become meaningful enough to avoid the decision being considered solely automated? And second one, how can candidates meaningfully exercise their rights to explanation or contestation under GDPR if they are not even aware that AI system influence the requirement decision? Thank you.
Do you want to?
Yes, I would love to answer, but there's nothing about standards in there. This is a standards panel. If I could take it back to standards, the standards that are developed on the basis of the GDPR, they don't have this, they're not harmonized standards, and they don't have this effect of presumption of conformity. Now, how can you standardize Article 22, you said, right? Yeah, there is not something that really fulfills these requirements at the moment.
Could I answer in the context of the AI Act? So under the AI Act, you need to think about that very carefully in terms of risk, but you also need to have effective human oversight. How effective that human oversight, the implementation of that oversight needs to consider things like the reversibility of the harm and the degree to which that harm could be widespread. There's no absolute requirement to have a human in the loop for an automated decision. You could even say the whole AI Act is about automated decisions in a way. The only time that there is a mandatory requirement for human involvement is remote biometric identification, when I think there's a requirement for two people to be involved. I know that wasn't the answer you were looking for, sorry.
But after working with robots many years, I always thought about this reversibility of the harm a bit strange because sometimes their systems also act in the physical world, and there are many things unfortunately that they are irreversible. No, you cannot do Control Z when a robot or a system breaks a window or someone dies or so. No, I think that. Though, you raise a valid point that we were discussing at the Bias Project, when we were also asking in our surveys with people that interacted with AI systems to what extent they can actually contest some of these decisions. The problem, though, is that you may not even know that much about what happened there and whether like you are entitled to one of these. No, so on the one side, the HR professionals like would love also like to have a system that could help in that process, like in which like they would or provide the explanation like of not selection of the candidate and so on. But that is also like a very tricky, because then people would start using that system in order to start contesting, and I'm not sure like that they are very much fan of that. But the problem is the awareness and like how much then it is that, because the AI Act also focuses a lot on transparency in some of the systems. If they are high risk, it's very specific. If there are systems that may be used, but they are not on the high risk, it's only like about knowing that you are interacting with an AI system. But yeah, I wouldn't see like exactly like how that, especially like because of the degrees of automation, no? Like I think that it's not entirely that it's fully automated or not.
Just on this point on people not being aware, right? So that's something that is, I don't know if it's unique, but it's something that's always in our mind, especially around things like bias. And I think I can give this example because the standard's about to go to inquiry. But in the logging standard, we said if there's a risk that people won't notice the harm for a long time, because it's not statistically observable very easily, then you have, if there's a risk of that, you must log much more data about things like demographics. And that's an example of where, it doesn't say that in the law, but when we put the intent of the law and the different articles together, we can see that that is an appropriate way to comply with the law. And that's the sort of thing we can do in technical standards, which is quite powerful.
Which goes against like data minimization, you mean? Yeah. No, because like, I mean, I see the point like of the GDPR angle, like, and then like seeing like then like both they serve different purposes, but yeah, there is a way like in which like we could reduce biases, like in incrementing like the amount of data that we have.
It's a trade-off, right? I mean, people have a right to privacy, but they also have a right not to be discriminated against.
Yeah.
So there's a trade-off there, which I think Article 10.5 gives us some extra permissions on.
Yeah.
Did we have another question? Yeah.
Oh. So what is out of the standards is also as much relevant, I think, as a question as what is in the standards. Because you have the standards, then you have, I say it in very few words, the certification, the right to place on the market. Still, we noticed, for example, transparency requirements. A public administration, my view, cannot use a generative AI to rank and shortlist the candidates and attribute a score. Because then it has to explain the linguistic model. It can't, it has obligation under administrative law. And therefore, you see something which may be not in the standards. The product is the same, the LLM for score, regardless, I think, whether it's used by public administration or not, because the standards are more or less like this, horizontal. They don't necessarily always go into vertical, but still they cannot place, or at least for sure they cannot use it, cannot be used in this context because of transparency requirements. Okay, then you can have other requirements. For example, data minimization mentioned before. The higher view tool, because when we speak about AI-driven recruitment, we should look at the use cases. Otherwise, it's too abstract. Okay, one thing is to use AI to produce the advertisement, the job description, which is quite less risky. One thing is the example made before of the AI also looking at the micro-expression of the candidates. Here you have an issue of invasiveness, and the invasiveness as such, regardless of the standards you have, may make it unlawful. So this is also very important. I dismissed this feature of the AI because it was very invasive. It was intrinsically biased. So coming back to bias for me is the orientation. If you are looking for the Walt Disney face, this is the orientation. Then you can be unbiased because you look for the Walt Disney effect, regardless of whether it's a black or white people, but it's intrinsically unbiased. And also the word biased, however, leads to confusion because, as said before, AI works on bias. It works on patterns, orientation, things you try to achieve, historical patterns. So it's just the unacceptable orientation what you should look for. And finally, the last example, data minimization. There are products, for example, Eightfold AI, which relies on big data for the scoring. It's also what you do on social media, data from data brokers, all kinds of data, also not strictly relevant. So this probably, but I've not read all the standards, I must say, is not captured by the standards. There is not a standard of data minimization. But in my view, would be unlawful under data protection law because of lack of proportionality of the data collected for the functioning of the AI to recruit the person. So you see a lot of things which are out, but from a legal point of view, it will be interesting when this clash becomes manifest between the certification and the law around, and the overarching principles around. Also, platform works, for example, gives sectorial indications. I'm not sure that for work management takes into account what you cannot do under platform work directive. So one more example. So
thank you.
That's all.
You want to, anyone to react? Or?
So, yes, you're right. We can't take into account every piece of sectoral regulation, national law, EU law, and we don't try. GDPR is probably the one where, because we have a lot of data protection specialists in the AI standards room, we tend to kind of warn the reader that there might be other regulation that they need to consider. But in principle, we focus exclusively on the AI Act, and it's up to the user to join that with other pieces of regulation. This is particularly hard, even with other product safety pieces. So under medical device law, you can consider the benefit to society to offset the risk of a medical device. In AI, you can't do that. You can't consider the benefits. So if you have an AI-enabled medical device, you have to apply one law to one part of the device and one law to another part of the device. It's really hard. But the system is designed for that. Much like the principle of lex specialis in law, we have the principle in the NLF of complementarity. But not everything sits within the new legislative framework, like, for instance, GDPR.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, I am Fjaka from Leiden University. I would like to know, how it's possible for regulators to ensure that the standards do not become like a checkbox, and then in reality, some sort of ongoing discrimination goes on. Currently, what ensures that this is not like a checkbox compliance, but doesn't in reality address problems? And I just wanted to know, considering even in Europe, there is a different understanding of the discrimination, of fairness. I see actually this kind of concepts to be pretty cultural in a sense. Do you believe that harmonized standards are capable of adequately operationalizing these fundamental rights, or there is still risk actually because of the differences in understanding of these kind of principles? And only with regards to the sensitive data that are sometimes necessary to train this kind of AI systems, we know that there is the safeguards for using sensitive data are quite high in EU. So how can we use this kind of sensitive data to train these systems, or this is going to be outside of EU, or how is this going to happen? Thank you. I think I made too many questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start and hand off to someone else. So in terms of how can we ensure this is not a checkbox activity? Well, first of all, there is the commission which participates in in the standardization meetings, but also, as I said, it's not only the technical experts who are sitting in the room. So we do have fundamental rights experts, we do have lawyers, we have ethicists, and we have people from many different backgrounds sitting in the room. So they are there in order to ensure that that the standard we write actually covers the bias, fundamental rights risks, and so on. But at a higher level, actually it's written into the NLF legislation that if it turns out that you've put a product on the market and that product creates a risk, in this case also a risk to fundamental rights, and this product was, however, compliant with the standard, you can then say, oh, well, that standard was no good, go back and fix it. So that's also embedded into the NLF legislation, although I would pass it to the legal expert whether that actually works in practice or not.
Yeah, so indeed it is a reversible presumption of conformity. So if there is proof that it's not working, then yeah, you can be still held liable, right? So it's that's the case. First, and second, it's a matter of expectations and realizing what the standard is meant to do. It is not meant to operationalize any fundamental rights. No, that we have the legislation for that. You comply with a standard to fulfill some technical component requirement in an act. You're still liable for anything, the overall idea, the overall conformity and compliance with the fundamental rights and everything that comes with the act and with it. So the standards have a very small guidance, technical guidance role. It's not meant to operationalize fundamental rights. So that's as long as, so maybe people have different expectations of, this is what I said in the beginning about the golden idea standard, that's you comply with it and then you're safe. But that's not the case. So, and people who are manufacturers or deployers that are conforming with the standards, they should also know this, that they're not bulletproof. It's guidance, offering a reversible presumption of conformity, and that's all.
If I can just add to that, standards are not the only part of this system. It's just one part. When you go through compliance using a standard or not, you have to go through something like a conformity assessment ex ante prior to placing the product on the market. That may have to be a third party, a government appointed auditor that comes and checks your system. And in many cases, they will actually test your system to see if there is bias. Once you've been through that process, you then have to file hundreds of pages of technical documentation with the regulator, again, before you put the product on the market. You have to attach a CE mark to your product. We're not quite sure what that will look like on AI systems yet, because they're not packaged, but we'll work that out, I'm sure. And then we have market surveillance. So there are circa 1,000 fundamental rights authorities in the EU. I haven't done the maths, but there's a lot. Any one of them can start an investigation. The public can make complaints to market surveillance authorities and start an investigation. And that, when a market surveillance authority starts an investigation, they will first of all look if you actually registered your system and submitted all the documentation. And if you didn't, they'll be immediately asking you why not. And they're quite within their rights to say, shut down your system now. You didn't follow the process. And this is going to be a real culture shock to a lot of technology organizations who are used to not really doing anything about compliance until they get a complaint. Now, obviously, the enforcement system will be different in each country. There's different national laws and things like that. But there's a very powerful system there that was designed to make sure that we don't get poisoned by our food and the buildings don't fall down around us. And that's now being implemented for AI.
I just wanted to add that in Spain we have an expression that is called, it doesn't translate well, but it's like, do not ask for pears from an elm tree. So sort of like a little bit like on this idea of like, do not ask everything from a standard, no, because it might not give you. But I like the point of what you said. In data protection law, we did have like a very clear organizational and technical measures, which kind of like implied very clearly that it was not only about taking a technical approach like towards data protection, but that you needed like to do something else. I think that in the AI Act, it's much more on the risk management, like, and then it's a little bit like perhaps like more hidden, like not that explicit, but I think that that is more like on the part of the culture then, like of the very same organization that may develop those systems.
We have time for one quick question, if it's quick. I think the gentleman in blue in front here.
before that, the black.
Yeah,
Go.
go ahead.
Say it.
Yeah, my question is about testing acceptance criteria and how do you set in practice how much of the bias is acceptable and what is the state of the art. And
How much you can
where
discriminate.
do you search for the specific metrics, what is good enough and what is not good enough?
So that's the whole bias standard. You want to come and join us? Those are actually the fundamental technical questions that we are grappling with. Also because you cannot set a testing acceptance criterion without knowing exactly which metric you're talking about, without knowing exactly which context it's being deployed in, and without really assessing the vulnerability of the people who might be impacted. Not only that, the testing acceptance only goes as far as showing that there is bias. And as we've said, bias is not necessarily purely a bad thing. And so once you've established that there is bias, it has to go back to your risk management team, and they have to understand, okay, this bias, does it pose a risk of discrimination? If yes, what are the impacts? Possibly it's not a risk of discrimination. It might actually be a risk to health or safety. So a bias could also be in, like an automotive system that is supposed to detect pedestrians, but if you're wearing a striped shirt, it fails more often. That's bias. It's not discrimination. It will harm health or safety of people who are wearing striped shirts. So this is, again, the interplay of the different standards and the different approaches. So bias is simply detecting that there is a difference, and it goes to risk to figure out, well, is this difference bad, and bad in what sense? I don't think I fully answered your question, but as I said, please come join our project.
And that is all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for coming to our panel. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists.